Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the FSR Policy Briefcase with me, James Kneebone, and
me, Leonardo Meus.
This is a new podcast series from the Florence School of Regulation where we discuss a key topical issue in the world of European policy and regulation through the lens of our most recent policy brief, which, for those not familiar, are our format to deliver concise and focused policy messages. The policy briefcase will be released on the first Tuesday of each month, guest featuring an author from the policy brief in question, as well as, of course, myself and Leo, who will be your regular hosts. We intend to use the policy briefs as the basis for a wider discussion on these kinds of topical issues, and therefore we will take comments and questions from listeners, as well as sharing our own views where appropriate. As I said, each episode will feature a different guest author, but the first episode is just the two of us, as the lead author of this week's policy brief is Leo himself. Although, of course, several other FSR researchers contributed to this piece, namely Ilaria Conti, Lucila de Almeida, Jean-Michel Glachant, Lee Hancher, Max Munchmeyer, Andrus Pibags, and Alberto Potocznik. A star-studded lineup of authors like this could only be assembled for an important and wide-reaching paper. In this case, it was Energy Policy Ideas for the Next Commission, referring, of course, to the end of this European Commission mandate, which began in 2019 and will be concluded later this year, to be replaced by a new College of Commissioners after the European elections in June. So, Leo, I have some questions about the paper, but would you like to first give a quick introduction?
Yeah, thank you, James. So I think this is a bit of an unusual policy brief because normally I think we stay within the comfort zone of our own expertise and we focus on one legislative file or one issue where we think we can add some advice or some recommendations. But as you said, we have the elections coming up and that's a moment to zoom out, right? To take stock of what happened, but also to look forward. So we felt we had to be part of that conversation. And as you said, that's why you could not rely on one or a small team of people. We really had to engage many colleagues, and beyond the authors, many others contributed. And also we put up a process that was quite unusual, I would say. So we have these, what we call our Policy Advisory Council, twice a year, where we give our stakeholders an update of our research. And this time we said, let's turn it around and let's create a brainstorm session with some of these stakeholders and colleagues to see if we could come up with some ideas for the next commission. And that was really nice. We were outside here in June, good weather. We had lots of post-its and we organized these post-its. We clustered them in some main ideas. And then somebody had to start writing that. So over the summer, we then tried to write it down. We had many feedback rounds because everybody felt quite strong about this topic, rightfully so. And then that already led us to October, where I first thought to have a workshop to start disseminating the work, but then we were still drafting, so we were so close to the workshop that we said, you know what, let's wait with the publication till after that workshop, and I'm happy we did that, because even in that last fine-tuning, we still got some good feedback. Then in November, we had the opportunity to present the brief to the incoming Belgian presidency of the Council. That was thanks to the EY President and Egmont Institute. And that was also very interesting, and we hope in the coming months we continue to be part of that conversation because many people are thinking about what the next commission could do. We realized that this brief was a kind of a work plan for us because we realized many of these ideas deserve more research and more thinking. And it turned out to be useful also to schedule our research and our workshops in the coming months. We have on Friday a workshop on governance. We will have then a few weeks later on offshore. And in April, probably we do a stock-taking exercise on the Green Deal. So yeah, it's has been a really interesting exercise.
Yeah, and I think for exactly this reason, it feels like the right place to start for this podcast series, right? Because it's sort of this kind of framing kind of paper. And actually, I remember this day in June that you mentioned where we were outside and sort of brainstorming. And if I remember correctly, I was in the session where this notion about the NECPs and taking a sort of renewed focus on them was brought up, I think, by Andrus. And in the paper itself, one of the issues that you raise is basically you talk about the sort of widening gaps between the European ambitions and the translation of those to the national level, so specifically via the NECPs or the National Energy and Climate Plans. And you suggest that member states could be made more accountable perhaps via better tracking and monitoring via central authority, and this would follow a sort of EU energy and climate plan, right? You also propose linking funding to the achievement of those targets, for example, Next Generation EU or cohesion funds. Essentially, those funds could be withheld for failure to achieve the targeted levels. So this could certainly be a big incentive to meet the targets, but without increased capacity building or a burden sharing mechanism, it could just be punitive for those countries with limited room for maneuver, right? So particularly when you consider that the level of European ambition has increased quite aggressively since 2020. Particularly, I would also reflect on the fact that a lot of the sort of low-hanging fruit of decarbonization was done by 2020, right? So in that context, it sort of provokes the question, is it realistic to expect more from the same resources? Is it an issue of motivation, or ultimately would it be a case of having to implement, both the measures in parallel, i.e. capacity building and stronger incentives and disincentives?
Yeah. So capacity building, just to clarify, what we had in mind is the fact that in the current Commission, we introduced so much new regulation, really very important regulatory frameworks that still have implementation components, right? Some of it is due to acts that still have to be done at the European level, but a lot of it is also at national level. So in Brussels, people are saying, the next Commission, hopefully it could be maybe even Ursula von der Leyen again, because then at least we are sure that the next Commission might focus on implementation.
Yeah.
And that implementation, their capacity building is needed because we notice that many ministries, national administrations are struggling to keep up. We notice that as experts as well. Even for us, it's really hard to keep up. So for me, capacity building is really there to make sure that ministries have the people and the resources and hopefully also the help of experts to do that implementation. Then the gap is maybe something else. There maybe it is partly willingness and partly an issue. So it's easier to agree altogether, member states, on an EU target than to agree on what that means on your national commitment to invest.
Yeah.
And there, indeed, we are a bit worried. Not only because of what we see in those plans, but also what we see in the implementation of the plans, right? Because the plan is just one thing. You also need to check what is happening really in terms of implementation.
Yeah, indeed. And on that point about burden sharing, is it too late to introduce a mechanism like this to help member states achieve these European goals? I know the final plans are due already by the end of June this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think you checked the numbers for me, right? Maybe we can already share the numbers because that was quite new information.
So as per the latest assessment, which at the point of recording includes an assessment of 21 of the member states. I think there are a few others who have submitted, but too late for final assessment. And at the moment, we are 4 percentage points short of the greenhouse gas emissions reduction target, so 51% rather than 55. We are 6.2 percentage points short on effort sharing sectors compared to the 40% target. We're sort of between 40 to 50 million tons of CO2 equivalent short on the 310 million ton target under the LULUCF. And for renewable energy, as far as that's regarded, we're sort of around 39% targeted deployment in the mix by 2030 compared to a 42.5% target. And energy efficiency is really far off. This is about 6% as per the current targets and needs to hit 12% by 2030. So on some of them, the EU is actually relatively close, right? But in some cases, only a few percentage points. But do you think that the reforms you propose could already be implemented in time to get us to that 2030? I know, like in the case of the 2020 targets, for example, it was looking for a long time as if we wouldn't make it, right? But right at the last moment, and I think maybe you could explain a little bit why, we did just get over the line.
Yeah. So, countries did a lot of efforts to reach the 2020 targets, but at the last moment we also had the crisis, which lowered demand a little bit and which helped also a little bit. So, and I think that's also good to remind people that financial crisis in 2009 was also a moment where people felt in the conversations, the early conversations on what should we do for 2030, that the ambitions lowered a little bit. And I think that's when this burden sharing we had for 2020 was a bit abandoned, and when this idea of these national energy and climate plans emerged. Like, let's leave member states a bit more free in how they achieve the big EU targets, and in that freedom also maybe consider interactions between different targets, because when we did, for instance, the burden sharing in the past for 2020, for instance, on renewables, maybe some country might be willing to do less on renewables, but more on something else. So the idea of these plans was also, let's see which countries are willing to overperform in some areas and then maybe underperform in others, but as long as it all adds up, it's okay. But at the same time, there was also a bit of worry, right? If you give that freedom to member states, it might be good, but it might also be bad in the sense that it might easily lead to us not achieving our ambitions. And then the numbers you quote we could look at it in two ways. It's not as bad as it might have been, right? It could have been worse, but especially as you said on energy efficiency, only half is really problematic, right?
It's really problematic.
And also, I think people are worried because these pledges, in a way, how much policy is already in place and how much budget has already been earmarked to make it credible that countries would actually reach these pledges, right? That's also why we're a bit worried. On your other question on could we still go back to burden sharing on some of these individual targets like renewables? Well, we're not that far because the current legislation already includes indicative targets.
Right.
So if we somehow, we already have the reference, so if we somehow find ways like linking it to funding, as you said in the beginning, one of our ideas, you make it more binding than it currently is.
Yes.
And that was also foreseen. So you already have people thinking of next steps. Next steps is to maybe introduce stronger measures to make sure we reach our EU target. So that's already happening in a way.
Yeah. And were you worried, just fundamentally about the fact that only 21 of the member states managed to get their plans in and submitted in time and assessed in a timely manner? We'll get onto it a bit later in the conversation, but is this issue about administrative capacity and compliance with these kind of general frameworks something problematic in principle, which sort of provokes this idea that you might want to tie it to funding to make these things a bit more important? It also wasn't widely published in the media. I don't feel like I saw that much reporting at the time about the NECPs and the renewed look. Yeah, I think it's both. I think we have to help member states, but also make them accountable. Yes. That's why we really have both as ideas put forward. It's not only about hitting them for... No. And that came across in the policy brief, I would say. It was clear that there was a focus on capacity building, but also a focus on ensuring that these things are really taken seriously and that there are consequences, right? Yeah. And there are big funds available in the EU for these kind of renewables projects, decarbonisation projects, right? So you want to tie that to the high achievers. Yeah. As goes the structure of the policy brief, we're going to be jumping around a little bit onto the different points. And next, I'd like to introduce this subject on regional tariffs that was brought up, right? So I like the idea in principle of introducing these regional tariffs, which would hopefully help to socialize the cost of new network infrastructure, because under the conventional system, it's just sort of a cross-border allocation, which, at times you could see perhaps as a bit of a blunt instrument that doesn't reflect all of the utility of a new piece of infrastructure, right? Sometimes it's more at the regional level. So we already have this kind of regional component to the risk preparedness plans in the gas sector, for example, where storage might be procured across borders and within regions. And I was wondering, were there any kind of particular projects you had in mind when you proposed this idea of regionally socializing the cost of these kind of projects?
Yeah. You know gas better than I do, but I follow electricity a bit closer. And we have the 10E regulation, right?
Yeah.
We already had the idea that we have to get beyond this territorial principle that everybody just pays for the assets that are located on their territory, because maybe there are beneficiaries, neighboring countries. So we already had that, but we've sort of, only done it project by project, and only in extreme cases where we could clearly identify a third party that benefits, that was not directly involved in the project. Very few cases we've also had decisions by regulators where these third parties paid part of the costs. But if we look at some of these infrastructure challenges we have before us, like offshore grids, CCS, hydrogen, this is of another complexity in a way. Yeah. And also we felt that there it's more difficult to go project by project and to have some kind of formula to allocate costs among whoever benefits. So we felt maybe there we could go to the next level of ambition and to say, if I just take the example of offshore grids, lots of countries are already looking at these offshore hubs, Sometimes that can even be combined with hydrogen. And then the question is, will we look at them project by project, or do we consider this North Sea as a kind of a regional plan?
Yeah.
Because maybe if we look at that regional plan, more countries will be convinced they benefit. And then more easily you can come to a cost sharing that is maybe a bit more simple. Yep. Because you don't need to allocate the last euro because you feel if this group of projects gets built, we benefit enough to share a reasonable level of the costs. And then indeed the question is, do we do that regionally? Or do we have to go more for EU? And to the extent that we feel beneficiaries are across whole of Europe, it of course becomes a bit more complicated because more countries can say no. But at the same time, it's to be discussed. So it's an idea we put forward, but we do not yet have all the ideas figured out. And that's why one of our workshops is actually exactly on that topic. Yeah. And I also expect us to come with policy briefs that go deeper into that idea.
Wow, very good. When reading the policy brief, this is sort of just like a general takeaway that I felt when going over the text was there was a consistent issue raised throughout on data, or lack thereof, let's say. I mean, this was true of the NECP stuff, but it was also true when you were referring to the crisis, for example. I mean, you made mention of the use of IEA data, for example, frequently in the crisis, and the fact that it wasn't ideal, essentially, that Europe was relying on these resources, as useful as they proved to be, of course. I mean, could you elaborate a bit on this vision for what you propose as an EU energy agency in the text? So how it might be resourced and perhaps how it might interact with the existing tools and agencies. So, I don't know, Eurostat, for example, or the European Environment Agency, which are often promoting these things.
Yeah. Also to be mentioned is that some countries already have energy agencies, sometimes at a very local level to help people, but also sometimes at a national level to support national policymakers. Only a few countries have a big mandate for these agencies, but in many cases it's sometimes focused on innovation, for instance. The idea is that these agencies can develop more technical knowledge and to really support policymakers with information, as you say, but it can be more than information. It can be about policy assessment, impact assessments, and recommendations. And that's why we linked it to the EU National Energy and Climate Plan. If we would go there to an assessment that is stronger on recommendations, it could be good to have an agency supporting that. But also that agency could do other type of things that we have in the brief, because in the brief we also talk about this Critical Raw Materials Act. Yep. And the fact that we don't yet have a lot of technical expertise in analyzing risks related to critical raw materials. The same with risks on industry, relocating. Yep. These are all new issues on which we need to develop more technical competence. And then the question is, in the CRM Act, for instance, there is the mentioning of the European Critical Raw Material Board. In the Net Zero Industry Act, there is this idea of a new platform. So instead of having all these platforms and all these boards, maybe some of it can be brought together in a new agency. Yeah. But then the next question, and that connects to one of your previous questions, is can we get it all implemented before 2030, that it's not too late? Well, that's why we said maybe instead of creating a new agency, another option is the same concept could be used to reinforce ACER. So you could put that, just as an additional tasks be given to ACER. And that's another way, right? To avoid that it takes too much time to set this up.
Yeah, and that was also a consistent theme throughout, right? Like in this organization, governance structures, et cetera, and whether it's more efficient and more effective to have lots of sort of, you might say fragmented, or you might say specialized, different groups working on specific projects, or if you try and amalgamate or, streamline is a euphemistic term used, but in other ways, if you're to follow this example you mentioned about ACER, if you're not increasing the capacity of that organization to perform that task, how are you reorganizing in order to do it in the most efficient way? And this is cropping up in the subject of data now, but it will also crop up later on the issue of network governance, right? So this is maybe something that's a consistent issue that needs a real critical eye going forward, right? And whilst we're on organizations, I guess we saw DG Reform and JRC, the Joint Research Centre, crop up several times in the document, which, it makes sense, it's intuitive given that we had such a focus on capacity building. But what about the other side of the equation, i.e. reducing the administrative burden, right? So we know that the Commission's long-term competitiveness communication sets a target of reducing burdens associated with reporting requirements by 25% without undermining the policy objectives of the initiatives concerned. This is by 2030. But yeah, this is something I didn't see addressed in the policy brief. So you sort of focus on the other side of the equation, increasing capacity building and streamlining in administration and so on. But yeah, it was the fact that you omitted this point about reducing reporting requirements and such because you feel that the NECPs and statistical reporting in this area are not the appropriate place to make the cuts, or yeah, what was the logic here?
Yeah, one of the reasons that we said maybe we should have a bit more EU organization around the NECPs is because it could help address the fragmentation of the reporting. So it is true that many pieces of legislation ask their separate report, and then the idea is that all of that sort of accumulates into that national energy and climate plan. But yeah, it is true that you could see whether we need that fragmented reporting or whether we can immediately go to a more EU type of planning. And how it connects with capacity building is also, is it even necessary that all member states develop their own regulatory impact assessments, or could that be more supported, right? And then places like GRC are places where modeling can be developed. DG Reform can then help to make sure that national administrations can use these type of models or have experts help them use these type of models. So I do hope we didn't address it explicitly, but I think implicitly some of these ideas we had go in the same direction, reducing the number of entities and maybe also reducing the fragmentation of reporting.
Yeah, okay, so it's not a case of reducing concretely the obligations required, but more like being more efficient in the organization of the actors that are doing so.
Yeah, and that's a nice way of saying it.
Yeah, so in a way you do also address that side of the equation. That makes sense. It seemed that one of the policy recommendations that perhaps received the most attention since the policy brief was published, which for listeners' info was just at the end of last year, was this proposal to build a sort of EU networks agency. So again, we're following this line of amalgamating, of streamlining, and this amounts to absorbing the various ENSOs and even the ENNOH, so this would be the Network Organization for Hydrogen, as proposed, into one organization. So could you just remind listeners briefly about the general logic behind the proposal and perhaps reflect a bit on the arguments for and against?
Yeah, the name we used for that idea was to have an EU energy networks entity, right? And then indeed, the level of controversy increases when you say it could merge the TSO entities, but even more if you then say it could merge the TSO and the DSO entities. So maybe that was even going too far, but at least we wanted it to be part of the conversation. Before I enter into why we came up with that idea, I do want to acknowledge, that these existing entities have been extremely valuable and extremely useful. Yeah. Just two anecdotes on that. Recently, we have a transport area. So in transport sector, they're looking at ENTSO-E or ENTSO-G as a model to consider in transport. So that's already, showing that it's definitely has added a lot of value. Also in the US, to my surprise, I was invited in a seminar together with one of the founders of ENTSO-E to talk about ENTSO-E, and the US was considering, shouldn't we have that type of entity? So, their value in network codes, in many of the integration harmonization we saw in previous years is undeniable. Yeah. But the problem we see for future is that we need more infrastructure. We already talked about it earlier. Yeah. And the more we invest in billions and billions and billions of infrastructure, the more you want planning of investments to be as neutral as possible, right? And that's where questions emerge because, of course, by nature, ENTSO-E plans are a bit more, thinking the future is electric, and the ENTSO-G plans are a bit more thinking molecules is the way to go. Also, another issue that emerges more and more is this trade-off between network and non-network solutions. If you ask a TSO to what extent you can avoid network expansion with non-network solutions, of course, even if they try to be neutral, the perception will always be that they're not necessarily so neutral. So by merging, we thought we could go beyond what we currently have, which is the fact that they already develop scenarios together, but really go further in that cooperation of joint planning. And then also the question emerges, is that enough? Or should they also become, that merged entity should also become more independent of their members?
Yep.
If you make the analogy with Acer, also in Acer, there is a board of regulators, but for the agency is not always overruled by the board of regulators. So you could have a board of members of TSOs, and the question is how powerful is that board versus the rest of the entity, right? So that's really part of the conversation, and that's how it emerged. Then I also wanted to mention that it's not completely new, that idea, because in the proposal on the gas package, it was already discussed to what extent the DSO entity we have for electricity should include gas, or should we have two separate entities. Also, another thing to mention is that the old idea that always emerges is the ISO, right? That's another way of dealing with it. So, but I think that would be more dramatic. If you really want, to disconnect system operation and system planning from the ownership, it's about creating a new type of company, an ISO company, which has been done in some countries. But if we would go down that route, it would take us much longer to achieve, I think, the same objectives.
Sorry, could you maybe just explain the notion of an ISO just briefly to listeners who might not be so deep in the subject?
So a TSO is an acronym for Transmission System Operator, but it doesn't say fully what it is, because what it is more than a system operator. It's also an entity that owns the network.
Sure.
So then, of course, if you ask that entity how much network we need to build, if that entity can also own it, there might be a conflict of interest there. While if you say, no, we separate the ownership from the operation and the planning, the planner is not going to own the network. So in that sense, should normally be more neutral. But that it creates other issues. That's why in Europe, we've never went down the ISO route, except in a few countries. But every time we have a conversation on should we make network planning more independent, the ISO comes back, right? Yeah. That's why we thought to refresh that debate, instead of putting the ISO again on the table, we said maybe we can achieve something similar in an easier way, which would be to have an entity, a grid entity, that is a bit less dependent on the existing TSOs, but is doing that type of hopefully more neutral planning.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, in fairness, what you're talking about here is ensuring that an organization that has really considerable responsibility in the future planning of the networks has really the governance structure that allows them to do it in, the most credible and objective way that ensures that position for a duration, right? Like a model that has legs, a model that can last. And we see the way that the sector is moving with decarbonization of the gas sector, right? This necessitates a high level of interaction between gas and electricity. And naturally, there will be potentially opportunity costs in the way that you build out those two infrastructures, right? I mean, of course, there are lots of really rigorous and impressive analyses that point to the fact that there are economic and security benefits, for example, of building networks in parallel. It's not necessarily about one or the other, but certainly there needs to be a high level of interaction in the planning between the two, right? And when it's being done, that it's done in the most transparent and credible manner and putting in a governance structure that reflects that, right? And this is, I think, also a little bit about the importance of social buy-in and these kind of things, ensuring that the public has faith in the way that these kind of decisions are being made, and to ensure that we're being, as serious and objective and harmonious as possible in how we're doing these things, right? So, yes, it's an interesting proposal, and as you say, it's sort of trying to add, at least as a reader, it was a sort of nuance to this ISO idea, but not completely revolutionary, let's say. So, super interesting. I mean, as I said, that was one of the main proposals that's received a lot of attention since, but I also wanted to get your sort of wider reflections. I mean, sometimes these briefs are just a good way to get a conversation going, right, on a given issue. And on the very first page, you say you're looking forward to further discussions. It's been a couple of months since the brief was published, and I was wondering, have you had any particularly useful feedback or discussions since then, or any particular change you would make if you were publishing the document now? I know you've presented it formally in a few different fora. You mentioned the Belgian presidency. I mean, what sort of feedback have you got? So first to say is that some developments already happened
by European institutions. So already the governance regulation is being assessed, right?
Yep.
There has already been a consultation on it. So you feel that there, on these national energy and climate plans, things are already moving. We meanwhile have also the final version of the electricity market reform. You have the gas package. So you feel also in these ongoing files, some of these things are picked up. We even had a grid action plan that still came out. So you feel that the current commission is not just letting things slide.
No,
right?
indeed.
They're already really doing on it. Industrial policy, security also remains high on the agenda. So I'm very positive in that sense. I get the feeling that many people see the issues similarly. In that sense, I'm also happy that we wouldn't rewrite the brief. It seems to be that the big picture, we got it right, but we deliberately stayed at a high level. So that means that, of course, we need to go deeper. And there, I'm also... we have research going on capacity mechanisms. We didn't talk about it, but that's one of the ideas we put in the brief, that they could play a bigger role in the future to guarantee that we have enough investments in energy resources. We have the whole offshore issue. We have electric vehicles. Also some work that is being done currently by one of our colleagues, Christopher John, on CCS, because also there are still many questions and action needed. We have another ongoing research by Lee Henscher and Jean-Michel on long-term contracts. And that connects a bit with the electricity market reform, because from a competition policy view, we've always been very careful in promoting long-term contracts. We've sort of discouraged it. So maybe in the future, in a new context with more investment, we need to reconsider that. I saw already drafts of that research. It's very, very interesting. Yeah. Also, another topic we have in a footnote of this brief is the whole story of Brexit, right? We have a trade agreement, but everybody thinks that trade agreement is, a bit, low ambition in a sense, and that if we really go for offshore, we might need more cooperation with the UK, and not only with the UK, with other third countries like Switzerland. Also that is a topic, right? Where I'm sure we will do more. But all in all, I think on the big picture and the main ideas, I think we sort of hit the nail.
No, certainly, and I would really encourage our listeners to take a look. I mean, it's roughly 10 pages. It's not a big document, but even in this fairly wide-reaching discussion, there are still lots left on the table we could have discussed. I mean, you mentioned capacity remuneration mechanisms. We have future episodes coming up on things like the electricity market design, which will, of course, has been a big focus of this commission, but will continue to be relevant for the next one. As I say, it's been a real pleasure to pick over the bones of this one with you, so thank you so much. And as I say, I encourage our listeners to go and take a look at the full document, and we'll be back with future episodes soon. So thanks very much, Leo.
Thanks, James.